Welcome to the Gird Up Podcast. My name is Charlie Ungemach. We're going to get to our guest in just a moment. But before we do that, please consider going down to the show notes below, clicking on the Gird Up website, and making a $5 cup of coffee donation. For $5, you can help support the work that we're doing here at Gird Up so we can produce more content just like this. Thanks for considering it. Our guest today is the Reverend Dr. Mark Braun. Good afternoon.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Glad to have you. You were a professor at WLC for a while. You served as a pastor for a while. You've written all kinds of things. But why don't you know yourself better than I know you. So
well, I liked it. Thank you. I liked it that you said my name correctly. I can still count on that in the Midwest. We still say Braun. And if your first question would be, are you related to? No, not John Braun, not any of them. I'm a non-clergy family. I was here from 1974 to 1978, got my call on call day to St. Joseph, Michigan, where I was a assistant and associate pastor there. Was in Sparta, Wisconsin, just west of where the highway splits.
Yeah,
94 goes north and 90 goes to La Crosse.
Was the giant bicyclist statue there at the time?
Yeah, that's gotten even bigger. That was, in fact, an old classmate from prep ended up on the Chamber of Commerce in Sparta and did a lot of work on building that into a bicycle empire. And I was at WLC for 34 years. And when I came there, it was it must
have been pretty close to beginning, right?
Well, I would call it the pioneer stage. There, the original group was 1973. I had a job in Thiensville tending bar when I was a SEM student. And one night, the one sophomore came in. There were like 15 freshmen, one sophomore. She was so excited. She couldn't wait to sit and talk with me on my break about this great school. It's like being part of a family. And I said to her, "You're crazy. I mean, there's no money, no professors, no building, no accreditation. So God has great sense of humor. Now you can work there." By the time I got there, we had 200 students, and we were going to survive. And people were not calling us Chicken Little quite as much as they used to. But they'd gotten accreditation of a 4-year school, and that first class graduated in spring of 87. I came in fall. And I was the only full-time guy in the department, so I could craft the 4-year program the way I wanted to, which is why Intertestamental was in the catalog all these years, because I wanted to do that. But saw the school grow tremendously. And may I also say, our relationship with the seminary, with MLC, is way, way better than it was. I think we see each other much more as partners and shared ministry. There was a little bit of turf guarding more than there is now, for sure.
Yeah, I've noticed. I wasn't privy to any of that as a kid, but I definitely felt it as a kid. And it seems to, by my observation, seems to have virtually disappeared, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing that helped was the number of faculty from here. Their faculty, sons and daughters, went to WLC. And first of all, they had to notice ways that we had to be different than MLC or the old Northwestern as far as curriculum and stuff. But they came to accept what we did. And it's a wonderful relationship now.
So what about the curriculum, especially in regard to religious curriculum, like theological curriculum, what has to be different at a place like Wisconsin Lutheran College versus MLC or the seminary?
Well, what has changed over the years is that we have a higher percentage of non-WELS and even non-Lutheran people. So you have to take that into account. And I think not even so much curricular-wise, but just everyday talk. We spend so much time doing the, "Hi, are you related to so-and-so? Are you WELS so-and-so?" I'll suppose when you're in catechism class, and that is unintentionally offensive to some of them who will say, "I don't have your experience." So you have to learn even just to program some of the things you say, "No, some of you had this experience." That had to change. We had to make more of an effort to understand people who just came in with not much theology. And we had all kinds of solutions, none of which really lasted a long time. And yet there are still some people coming who aren't sure, do I want to go to MLC? Do I want to be a teacher? We've had people do pre-seminary for other church bodies, not ours. But you really have to keep all of that in mind, that they don't have, by and large, the kind of immersion into WELS, into the bubble, that we had. And there are some kids there who came there because they got burned out on the bubble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the bubble. Let's talk about the bubble. What do you mean when you say the WELS bubble?
Well, I think we had a lot of students who knew each other and were even related to each other before they got there. They were at musical events together. They played sports against each other. They were cousins. In fact, my one son who went to MLC for 1 year, and it was not the right choice for him, but he stuck it out for the whole year. And he said, Dad, the strangest thing for me was to have people I never saw, never heard of walk in and say, I think we're related. Now, that is very comforting.
I've done that to people.
Well, for some of us, it's the initial way to get to know people, and we never have to go any farther. But for some people, it's not an encouraging thing. They feel different. I didn't always feel like I was in the group, so to speak. And I feel I can see that was more something I did to myself than they did to me. But I didn't have that same experience. So I think more than anything, it's a cultural thing. Students could do fine at WLC if they were good students and did their homework. Some of them made the complaint, well, I didn't have the experience all these people did having all this stuff in school. Well, do your reading. People can do fine. But there was also a cultural component, which I don't know that some of them ever quite get over that. I've talked to teachers who are now retired who said they went to MLC, but they'd gone to DMLC, but they'd been in a public high school and they had to take a placement exam for theology, and they still resented that they felt they were being judged. And I'm pretty sure they weren't, but they really carry that with them. So all of those things, and we talked a lot about it. Our department would talk about we thought we were doing a good job, and then occasionally we'd get somebody who was really irritated with us and said, you have an environment here that if you're not WELS, you can't make it, and all of that. So,
yeah. And you mentioned that there were all kinds of different solutions to that issue over the years, and most of them didn't last for very long. Yeah, good.
Well, when I got there, the solution was that all the Lutheran high school and prep kids could take a 1-semester refresher class in the Bible, which was whirlwind and way too surface, whereas the non-WELS school kids took a 2-semester intro to Old Testament, intro to New Testament. And those two courses were much more like the kind of course you'd get a lot of places, intro to Scripture. But of course, a lot of them resented that.
Which is similar to what MLC, I guess, I don't know, I'm not familiar with what MLC does now because it's been 15 years, but I think similar, where you pretty much work your way through Scripture again.
Well, and then that's the thing. For some of them, it wasn't again. It was the first time.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But at the time, those 2-semester classes counted toward for accreditation, whereas the 103 class did not. By and large, MLC said if your course description is close to ours, we'll accept that. That's gone through changes too. And then we've had like 3 levels of freshman class. And you could, at a time where you could test out of freshman theology and take 2 junior classes instead of 1. And none of them was really a successful long-term answer. I don't know what Mike Berg is doing now. He kind of inherited that from me.
Is it required to take religion courses if you're going to attend Wisconsin Lutheran College?
You have to have 12 credits in theology to graduate, which is 1 course for each year. And we put them together as a progression, although we didn't have any prerequisites.
Yeah.
But we wanted to have people acquainted with biblical theology, historic theology, confessional theology, and systematic.
Yeah.
And so it's when more kids came in from non-WELS, non-Lutheran backgrounds that you really have to think about what you say sometimes, and even some of your assumptions. I remember a Catholic kid came to me who'd gone to Catholic grade school and high school. He says, you teach these stories like you think they really happened. And I said, well, I do. And he says, well, what is we learned in Catholic school? These are kind of morality lessons. We have more and more kids that come from evangelical backgrounds, and the best of them really love the Scriptures, but they have no sense of a structure, like a dogmatic, systematic, no catechism. So they kind of have their favorite verse. And then we had the occasional Muslim, the occasional Buddhist, occasional Jewish person. I had one class, I had 2 people who were both pagans. One had been Catholic, one had been Lutheran. And they were respectful. They were interesting. They did not budge at all. Some people, of course, become Lutheran. I think the best recruiter is still Cupid. That a guy. Usually, it's the guy. It's usually the guy falls for the WELS girl, and she says, "This is not happening unless you come to adult class." I see him in church sometimes.
And we all know a few of them.
Yeah, we do, and of course, sometimes people don't always believe it right away.
Is it true that that's historically one of the reasons why I've heard it said, and you're the right guy to ask, maybe. I've heard it said that one of the big reasons why the Christian church became acceptable in the Roman Empire was because so many Roman soldiers were marrying educated Christian women.
That could be. I would not be able to vouch for that at all.
Well, may or may not be true. We'll find out. But
my era in the 60s and 70s, some of my guys had sort of a romantic view. They would like to, idealistic view. They like to meet the girl from outside the system. And that had mixed blessings, because you ask a girl who's sort of Christian, certainly not Lutheran, you have a romance, and then you say, now you're going to be living in this glass house, and you'll have all these expectations she didn't even realize existed. And some cases they went well, in some cases I don't think they did.
I don't know what it is in me, but for some reason I had the same attitude for a number of years, and I'm still single, so it quite worked out. And I don't know what it is. I for a while, for years, I was like, I don't want to marry a WELS girl, and I really don't know why my attitude was that way. But what I found very quickly was that, well, I guess that was going to be a hard journey if I was going to do that. And I tried a couple of times, and my attitude about those relationships was always, this is where I'm going, and if you want to come with me, get on board and let's go. And if you don't want to go there, which live a called worker life and the lifestyle, and this is where we're going to church, this is how our kids are going to be raised and so forth. If you don't want to get on board with that, just let me know now. Whenever you decide that, let me know, and we'll deal with that when it happens.
Yeah, I think that is what happens in some cases. I met a girl out of high school. I was out of high school. She had a year to go. Really a much better person than I was. And then I quit the system for a year and was working. So she finished high school, and I really thought at times we were going to get married. When I made the decision to go back to Watertown, it was just a matter of time. And she was way smarter about this than I was. She was not going to be able to conform to that, even though she was a really nice person. But I had friends, and I had this too, where I'd meet a girl at the cause party, and she was a 4th and 5th generation preacher's kid. She'd say, I'm not marrying a pastor. And
it's also famous last words, though.
Well, often, and then when one of those girls finally told her boyfriend she was going to marry him, I says, I thought you said you weren't going to. She said, I think he was different. Well, as it turns out, he probably wasn't. But I didn't think we talk about this at all. That's
all right. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you don't come from you don't have pastors in your family or anything like that. So what drew you into the ministry?
I really admired my home pastor, John Monke, at Mount Lebanon. He was a very helpful man to our family. And he had a system whereby he would pick out 3 or 4 boys, start before the 8th grade confirmation class, and, say, I'm going to have you in my office and talk to you about being a pastor. Well, he had me, and I pretty much made up my mind to go to prep. And so he said, so we had something else to talk about then, because what was I going to do in there? And he actually talked about the system he wished he would have started but never did, to collect information and quotes and have a file system so you could find it. And I thought it was interesting, but I wasn't going to do that until much later. But, and then, really, once you're inside the system, it's harder to get out than it is to stay. And so when I quit, I was not a good student from the end of high school and the beginning of college, and I wanted to let circumstances make my decision. I'd fail 5th year Latin. I'd say, that's it. And if he passed me, I'd love to see his mathematics on that. I think Professor Schlenner worked to keep about 5 of us, all of whom went in the ministry. So I had to decide, I said, I'm going to quit. And right away you get your 1A announcement, and they're taking lottery numbers for Vietnam. And I really had no plan. I look back now, and think I was kind of like this organism that is in the water, plankton. It has no locomotive skills. It just drifts wherever. And I thought, well, that was kind of the way I was at that time. And I was, waiting tables and painting houses. And that girlfriend I mentioned who couldn't go along with the ministry, she says, why don't you come to MATC and take a guidance test to figure out what you want to do? So I took this thing and I matched up to a professor, a doctor, and a librarian. He says to me, what do you do? And I says, I wait tables at the Milwaukee Athletic Club. He says, you got to get out of that job. You got to not only go to school, you got to go to graduate school. And I said, I hate school. And then he said the really dangerous words. He says, maybe you're at the wrong college. And I mean, I don't think my family cared that much whether I got a degree, but they would like to see me go in the ministry. If not, well, college, well, okay, but you could get a trade. So not to say this with any sense of ego, whatever, but I feel like God kept moving things in a direction. This is somewhat of an inevitability for me. And I've been blessed way beyond what I deserve, both being a pastor and teaching. I never had any fear at seminary that the assignment committee was going to choose me to be a tutor. And I never wanted that kind of call.
I will go wherever you send me. But if I graduate from the seminary at 35 years old and get a call to the dorms, I don't know how I'll feel.
Yeah, you'd be the old man.
If I'm called to do it, I will do it. I will faithfully go where I am sent.
Yeah.
But at 35, if I get a call to the dorms, it'll be an adventure for sure.
Well, I would not have been the kind of candidate. They look for coaches. I wasn't a coach. I was a musician, played in bands, but not traditional music. WLC took a chance on me. I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. So you served in St. Joseph, you said?
Western Michigan, yeah.
Yeah. And that's historically a pretty big church, right?
It's a big Lutheran area. St. Matthew, which I guess is amalgamated with Good Shepherd to make another new little church. That was the mother church. And it was also a huge Missouri Synod area too. So this is one of the areas where Missouri and Wisconsin made the arrangement. You stay on one side of the river, we stay on the other. There was a big Missouri church in downtown St. Joseph, probably 3,000 members. And then Benton Harbor, the other side, went through a very rough racial issue with the school, public school system and the neighborhood and everything. And Ron Fryer, my senior pastor at Grace, was in Benton Harbor. He moved it across the river to St. Joseph's side, to one of the townships. And the story he told was that senior pastor at St. Joseph came unannounced to see him in his office and leaned over his desk, kind of like Khrushchev at the UN, and said, "We will bury you." But our church did fine. There are enough Lutherans to gather and enough people who needed the gospel so it was a wonderful learning experience. I'd vicared in Alaska for David Zietlow, and I had a very atypical vicar experience. No shut-in calls, didn't have a funeral. If he had a funeral in Alaska, it was highly traumatic. I preached every weekend. And so they did me a great favor by putting me in a church where I could learn everything, not from a bishop, but from my senior pastor.
Yeah. And then you said Sparta after that.
Yeah, he said to me, Pastor Fryer said to me, after 4 or 5 years, there's a good chance that if you get a call to a bigger church, I'll encourage you to go, not because I want to see you leave, but because I think you're getting such a good balance of things here compared to if you were a mission pastor for 5 years and had your 40 people, and that's a certain kind of experience too. But, to have a great school, to see a lot of shut-ins, to try and keep a vision of ministry, and then maybe throw in a crisis in the church recently, and all that's a pretty strong experience.
Yeah. So is that in Sparta?
Yeah. So I went in there thinking, I went to St. Joe thinking, how does anyone put this together? This organized machinery, this schedule, this growth. We'd confirm more adults than half the district sometimes. Well, I found out in Sparta I had to figure out how to put something together like that, because that was a highly pastoral-driven ministry there. And but I came out of there thinking, I don't know if I should be doing this. And I took the call to the college, and I was probably there 3 weeks, and I thought, well, if I can't do this, then I'll leave, but I wouldn't go and apply for a call back to a parish.
Yeah, that's interesting. So is it that you didn't enjoy being a parish pastor, or what do you think it was?
It's hard to say. I think there were a bunch of things. I had neighboring pastors that said, well, until you make a call in the barn and the cow swipes your suit pants with his tail, or unless you go out helping them, bale hay, you're really not in the congregation. And I guess I'd always liked to read, although I wasn't a terribly good student for quite a while. And I took a chance on it. And I don't think I'd like teaching any other age group. I mean, I could have gone to MLC, but I don't think I'd have taught grade school or high school very well. But college, I mean, I'm sure some people didn't like me, but it worked for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and certainly you get to do all kinds of pastoral work, whether it's part of your job description or not, when you're at a institution like
you get
that.
to do the parts really that are the most fun in some ways. The college had a rule that pastors could not become vacancy pastors because it was untold how much you'd be required. But, to go and preach and to help out to teach, they were happy that we would serve that way too.
Yeah. So then you show up at WLC, like you said, you had to kind of build a curriculum from the bottom up.
Well, it was a 2-year curriculum.
A 2-year curriculum.
Yeah. So I think you had to say, well, what things should be in the junior and senior? What things should we have that we don't have? I didn't have to get anybody's permission because, there's nobody else in the department. So that first winter, I took about 30 catalogs from other different colleges, and I thought, well, we need a fuller biblical studies curriculum. So I added a Genesis class, added the intertestamental classes. I wanted to learn that. 10 classes. I thought we should have a class in non-Christian religion. So guess who teaches that? In the first couple of years, I was not knowledgeable at all. Now I'm only minimally knowledgeable. I didn't have a course in it, any of it. Teaching American religion got to be my favorite class. And when I went, I really, in a way, wanted, they tell you in the call letter, accepting the call, you obligate yourself to pursue the terminal degree, which I didn't even know what it meant. I thought you go to school till you're dead, which was just about true. But, whatever it is, it isn't always a PhD. And that was an expectation. And Hebrew, oddly enough, Old Testament and Hebrew really turned me back into a student between Paul Eichmann at college, getting to know the Hebrew better, and then John Jeske showing that it can be useful in preaching. And so I had a dream that I could be doing sort of what John Lorenz and John Brugge did, a multidisciplinary. I could never have handled it. So by the time I went to Concordia, I decided I was going to, I had enough credits from here to have a minor in their doctoral program. I think nothing but church history. It took me a couple of years to figure out what I might want to do for a dissertation until I was the only WELS person in a class on Missouri Synod history. So the professor would always look at me and say, what do you guys say about this? And he knew sometimes better than I did. So that's how I ended up, going in that direction. And I'd had no idea that I'd write a dissertation on church history, no less our church history.
Yeah.
I wrote a really awful, shake it out of your sleeve paper for senior church history. It's 5 pages long. There's no research in it at all. And why that's on the WELS essay file, I have no idea, because we have no say over what goes in there.
Somebody was scrolling down and saw, oh, Mark Braun.
Well, Jim Tiefel went there to help out for a couple of years. So he calls me and says, I was wondering, since you belong there, what, you know much about this church. I says, well, actually, I says, but it's not going to help you because it has nothing to say. And he called me a couple of days later and says, you were really right. That paper does have nothing to say. But, and then the third year summer I went to St. Louis, I was taking all church history class of all kinds. And the academic dean, who was a former WELS pastor, said, the faculty told me we're not going to give you a degree unless with a minor in biblical studies, unless you take one course in Old Testament, one course in New Testament. I've signed you up for them. So he signed me up with Jeff Gibbs, who's a New Testament guy, and that was rapid reading of Greek without discussion of theology, all syntax, yikes. And then the Old Testament class was with Job with Chris Mitchell. Mitchell's at the publishing house for 30-some years. Mitchell went to Madison as an agnostic, and in the course of his time there got under the influence of the Missouri Synod campus ministry. I've never talked to him about this, but this is the story. He became so interested. He stayed and got a PhD in biblical Hebrew with a minor in classical Greek, then went to St. Louis and was a pastor for a year, and he's been at the publishing house for 37 years. And his dream was to be involved in putting together a Concordia commentary. They tried this twice before, but they had political and other problems, didn't do it, so this is going to get done. And he asked me, would you like to do one of these? And fool that I am, and remembering, I guess, that interest in Hebrew, he says, well, I think about the only book I could do is Judges. That's the first book we did after we were out of the textbook, and I'm not deep in Hebrew. And of course, now that I look at the volumes, I'm really not. But he said, well, we'll give you time. And I realized that they weren't beating down the doors to want to do Judges, because it's a complicated book in its own way. So now I'm at the point where they've got my manuscript, and one editor's worked his way mostly through it and given me many suggestions and some corrections. And Dr. Mitchell said, give me a narrative, and I'll fix your Hebrew. So I am probably, I hope, going to look smarter than I ever could be.
That's funny. Give me your narrative, and I'll fix the Hebrew.
Well, I mean, and Judges is, I think, pretty easy, except for the Song of Deborah, which is a beast. But, there's all kinds of things. I could do that in English. I had an English class, and they said, explain why this is, find the things that are different that you want to pay attention to. I could do that. But in Greek and Hebrew, I really couldn't unless I looked at a commentary and said, oh, yeah, now I see that. I see that.
Yeah.
I see this word order thing, and there is not verb-subject agreement, or this could be like this.
Frankly, that's comforting to hear you say that, because as a guy I love being a student here, and I'm very excited about the opportunity to someday serve in the pastoral ministry. But boy, the languages are tough. I just have found the languages to be tough. Actually, even just working over into the summers as a landscaper, I picked up Spanish and things like that. But when you sit down and you have to crack the book and look at the grammars and all that, it's just a tough thing for me. So it's comforting to know that
I have to be careful what I say, because by and large, the people that have written Concordia commentary volumes are all people like that have the language. One of them has a Hebrew dictionary at his bedside table and reads it at night. And I do think, though, that there's a lot more people in both synods that are like me than are like them. And I have made the case sometimes, I think Dr. Mitchell doesn't like it, but I've said it seems to me sometimes that the Concordia's commentary system is written by grammarians for other grammarians. And, what about... Well, I mean, there's a format. It doesn't have to be tightly observed, but there's a format. But I certainly have the sympathy for the person who says, what am I going to do with Judges here? What do I?
Yeah.
I remember listening to a sermon in the area. A young pastor preached on Ehud stabbing Eglon. And, it was interesting. It was his homework, I guess. But when he got to the end part, what do you say about that story? What do you say about Jephthah, who, how much of a faith did he really have? So I sort of approached the whole task with, what does the church do with the book of Judges? Because it's not the kind of book that I found people don't want to read about it in Bible class.
Yeah.
But in a way, I'm very grateful that at WLC you had to be a jack of many trades and a master of none, especially we were so small. So this gave me a chance to learn, to read all of the scholarly literature on this, to try and understand. Certainly I've learned a lot by doing it. And Dr. Mitchell's going to have a busy year this year.
So, you got perhaps these are spoilers, but was not Eglon. Who's the left-handed guy?
Ehud.
Is Ehud left-handed, or does he only have one hand?
It says he's bound in the right hand. So that could be that he was injured. But also, it seems as though there were several places where Benjaminites, who means son of the right hand, would deliberately bind young men's strong hands that they'd learn to sling stones with either hand very accurately. It was a chosen thing. But, you can go to archaeology sites where they have these narrow passages. You'd have to get through the wall. And everything was suited to keep a right-hander in trouble so he could, do this the other way.
Yeah.
There's something about the whole story that's very left-handed about how Ehud went about things. And with that and some other stories, you get done and say, well, was this a good thing? Is this going to do thou likewise? Is it just simply history that says this is what they did? Ehud, fortunately, is not mentioned as one of the heroes of faith, but Jephthah is, and Samson is.
Did Jephthah kill his daughter, or did she go roam the hills?
I think he did it. But then what does that say about him?
Right.
What kind of faith did he have, if any, or was he facing... he'd already been told that he, go into battle and you will be successful. He ready. So, but what's been most surprising to me is the number of they're pretty old now, but current evangelical commentators who have a high view of Scripture, but are really hard on these guys compared to like Kylan Delitzsch and Edersheim, who frankly don't go very deep into it, but just regard them as heroes.
But and you mentioned Samson too. Like Samson was a judge for what, 20 years?
Yeah.
And we have maybe a month of like actual things that he's doing.
Yeah.
Right. If you stack up all the days of activity that are recorded, I don't know. Maybe we just don't know. But what did the other 19 years look like? Right.
They get into that. I mean, the odd thing about it is that up to the second to last chapter before the whole business with Delilah, and that it said he was judged for 20 years. And then it says it again. So people have different schemes about where does that fit. And, did he have a strong sense of desire and other flaws? And after these incidents with the Philistines, he managed to hold himself back. But, it's the women are the problem for him. But he never seemed to have any real interest in wanting to get rid of the Philistines and be the Lord's judge to bring them control. He wanted to get along with them and marry them and be them a couple places where that the Lord does this to stir him to do this and create a tension between them. And again, we read that without giving a second thought, but there are commentators who say, well, the writer at certain points seemed to have an omniscient viewpoint. He knew what was going on with God and the person. And we don't ever even hardly think about that, unless you're really into the language stuff. But I found it immensely interesting. And then I have a section in the introduction, which I don't even know if it's going to get in the book, but the different ways Judges has been read since then. Of course, the Jews allegorize everything completely out of context. It's just like a book of precedents. Early Christian fathers saw the big story, but then they would allegorize things that were embarrassing or difficult to explain. And others use Judges as model behavior. Gideon was really well loved in American history because he was in a model of George Washington, who refused to take a third term. There's all this stuff going on. And, I don't know what my editors are finally going to say. And I have gone to the trouble of printing one copy of my manuscript just so that I'll know what I gave them before they all fix things.
So you mentioned, like, we just don't know what to do with this. Why? This is a huge question, so answer it as you will. Why did God give us the book of Judges, do you think?
Well, it is a real expose on original sin in terms of how they come into that period of time with a relatively high sense of spirituality, I would say. I mean, I don't know really how they held on as long as they did through Egypt, and whether, the first time Moses turns his back, they make a golden calf. So they must have had imbibed some of this, even if they were saying, I'm doing it for the Lord. But the judges were a pretty tough bunch of people themselves. You see this repeated decline in their behavior, and they just didn't want to get rid of, the people that were there. The church seems to be almost non-existent. What few Levites we meet are awful people. And they were about as low as they could get. In fact, I end by saying, who could ever imagine that God could bring a David out of this group? And he had his flaws too, but to be the leader he was, to be the man after God's own heart, and bring a Solomon, who also had his flaws. Who could imagine at the time that the North is gone and the South is in captivity, that God could bring them back and raise them up to be a people again and be the vehicle for Jesus to come into the world? So when we get very despairing because the world is so bad, don't sell God short for what he can do with us. And he's got to do with us because he doesn't have any other plan except us. So in that sense, people often, from a historical point of view, it showed the necessity of Israel having kings. And a remarkable thing is that we always say they had a theocracy. I can't find that word in dozens of books about judges. They never use it. Because rightly understood, the kings would have been a theocracy too. They would have ruled under God's guidance. But the kingship became inevitable, but then the kings didn't make things any better than the judges in many ways. One guy said, completely out of the mainstream, he said, I think Judges is the most practical book for our times. And he lists off, the bad marriages, the warfare, the violence, the fighting over the land, all of that. But in the end, it just shows that we desperately need a savior. There are books in the Old Testament that show the need, but don't show the solution. Ecclesiastes is doing that too. He puts into people's heart the desire for eternity, but we have to wait to hear more fully what that's going to mean. But all Scripture is inspired, but it's not all equally useful or easy.
Yeah. It's every once in a while you'll hear somebody talk about the idea that like we are somehow more advanced or something like that than the ancient world, as like in whether it's morality or whatever it is, or more intelligent or something, and that gets pretty readily renounced by the experts, right? And then every once in a while you'll also hear the opposite of that, where somebody will say something like, the world is worse than it's ever been before, or we've never seen this kind of wickedness or evil before, and
we just don't have the perspective, I think, to really know. I mean, we keep learning things about the ancient world, but is this really what you all wanted to talk about? I didn't know where we were going to go here at all.
Talk about whatever comes up.
Well, I talked about that one day in chapel a couple of years ago about the assumption that we're always making progress. And I said there's one particular commentator on the morning television that will complain about something and just say, in this day and age, we're still doing this. Well, who's to say that we're advancing technologically, but who's to say that we're also advancing morally? Are we less racist? I think we're more subtly racist than we used to be. You go all the way back to the Tower of Babel and think what kind of engineering they must have understood and how they did this. But the Tower of Babel is a picture of what kind of world you have if there's only STEM education. Lots of science and math and building things, but absolutely no sense for greater values. So even God says to themselves, we're scared that if they do this, there's nothing they won't accomplish. He's not scared for himself. He's scared for us. So, doing that kind of history, I think makes you much more humble about what we think we know about our times.
And your emphasis over the years has been, to a great degree, I mean, you've done plenty of writing on the scriptures too, but to a great degree has been church history and really even like more modern church history. What is it that drew you to particularly like the Lutheran Church in America and American church history as opposed to any other era of history?
Well, there's a dissertation upstairs by, he's an ELS retired professor now, but he was in the WELS for a while too. I can't think of his name. Actually, I'm surprised I got this far without mentioning. But he did a study of the comparison between the old American Lutheran Journal and the Confessional Lutheran Journal from a rhetorical point of view. How did they structure their arguments? How did they lay out their course? And the American Lutheran became Lutheran Forum, and Confessional Lutheran became Christian News. And I was fascinated by that. But I have no skin in the game as far as, again, I'm not related to anybody. So you've got, Mark Jeske writing the first dissertation on the Protestants since the 1930s, because, Pieper was his great-grandfather. And the Prangy brothers, I think, are on a continual quest to rehabilitate their grandfather's reputation. You've got the Wentlands and the Brenners that have got. At first, I thought that was a real problem for me, but then I realized I've got nobody's honor to try to protect, even subconsciously. But then when I took that class at St. Louis about Missouri Synod history, then I thought, well, maybe I could do that. I couldn't get too close, but I'm not really good enough at German either to basically say I think I can translate that German and catch the unique little ticks that are in WELS Germanism. So I sort of draw my line at 1920. But I also think I've been trying to figure out all these years, what is it exactly that makes us the kind of church body we are? I mean, in some ways, we're very typical of conservative Protestantism. We have a strong immigrant history. Germans were, especially the later 1800s after Bismarck, they came here kind of proud of their German heritage. They didn't want to give it up.
You say after Bismarck?
Yeah, I think the really early ones that came, my grandparents, great-grandparents came in 1866. In fact, I think my great-great-grandfather was a draft dodger to get away from that. But they came very poor. You know, I think many of them suffered a lot from the post-1848 stuff. But some historians have said that as you get toward the end of the century, they're coming and they're better off, and they're proud of that. And, you know, the first church is a shack, and the second one looks like Grace downtown. They want to show that they've made it here, you know. So in many ways, our history has similarities to many other immigrant bodies, but there are certain things which are quite unique about us. You know, the degree to which we practice fellowship in the way that we do. I would tell students to be bothered about this. I'd say everybody draws a line someplace. Even if they don't know they're doing that, they draw a line, and they're not saying, I can look inside your heart, or I think you're not a Christian, but everybody says, if we're on the other side of this line, I just don't know that I can do church with you. I mean, some people say you say Jesus is Lord. They're not even sure what that means. Right down to where your church has, you know, pancake suppers and ours doesn't, so we're not in fellowship. I mean, why did some of these things happen? Why are we this way? And that's all part of the WELS bubble too. And there are certain cultural parts of the WELS bubble I wish we didn't have, but I'm so much more comfortable. I sometimes thought I wasn't in the fraternity, but I always was.
Yeah. Yeah. I went through a little period of time where I can't always explain my younger self, but where I kind of decided I didn't want to be Lutheran anymore. And so I set out on this quest to go find, a better church, because I knew I couldn't go to a church that was just as good as my Lutheran heritage. I had to go find something better. And the more time I spent looking into all these other churches, the more, very quickly realized, one, I shouldn't say nobody else, not many other churches and church bodies are taking their identity and their theology nearly as seriously as we are. Mm-hmm. And second, it kind of drove me back into, well, why do we believe what we believe? And that kind of is what spurred me on the path that eventually started the podcast and landed me back in school to go back and be a pastor also. But doing that, just looking at doing the research to say, well, why do we really believe? I had doctrine courses and things at MLC, but really trying to understand why we believe what we believe and why we teach what we teach. Very, very quickly realized that most of my frustrations, or most of the things that I was running away from, were not doctrinal issues. They were application issues, and I can deal with application issues.
Well, it's cultural. You had a question on your email you wrote about doing history, mm-hmm. And one thing I would say is some of us just can't help it. Now, what I mean by that is, if you do Strength Quest here, do these.
I've never done Strength Quest. I've done a few of the other ones.
Well, Strength Quest, it really tries to get more nuances of this than just you're either an eagle or a penguin or whatever. But so they have this whole thing. You don't, like so many others, you don't even know what you're doing when you're doing this. It says, well, see, for me, it showed a historicist as almost the top thing, which is going to mean that whatever I do for a living, I would try to handle issues in life looking historically. What did they do in the past? And I've worked with other people. The historical is actually way at the bottom, and they will be so impatient. Who cares about all this stuff they did 75 years ago? And so you understand yourself and each other a little bit better. But I would say for me, doing church history has helped me to understand and sometimes even forgive and continue to belong to an imperfect church body. And I was asked to do the after dinner talk one time at the Lutheran Historical Conference. Yes, 40 people like me, sort of, that, some were pastors, some were professors, some were writers. And they all nodded when I said that. We know the church isn't perfect, but we understand what people were trying to do, even when it doesn't look like a good decision now. And of course, humanly speaking, some of those decisions hang so much on what appear to be accidental and coincidental. And God keeps on sparing his church and giving the right person to be doing the right thing. So I guess that's about all I can say about that.
Yeah.
I think I'm a more grateful member of the WELS from learning church history.
Yeah. And this is it sounds trite to say, but there is no perfect church.
No, there is no perfect church. And, if you went through a period where you're trying to find one, Spurgeon, there's a story about he had some young guy who came to his church. I'm looking for the perfect church. And he said, don't join it. You'll spoil it.
I like that.
Yeah, I hope it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. So you did quite a bit you kind of wrote the book, at least from the outside looking in, which is your phrase. You kind of wrote the book on the split between the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod. And I can imagine, and you mentioned kind of why you did so, or at least why you wrote the dissertation, right? Go ahead.
Well, in that class that I talked about, he had a lot of MDiv students, and there were a couple of master's or doctoral students. The requirement then was to do an extra long paper, minimum 25 pages. And he said, well, you should write one on the breakup of the Synodical Conference. And I had a month to do it. So I used all very official, predigested sources. And he was kind to me, but he said, your paper is unrelentingly hostile to the Missouri Synod. And he said, I think the story is more out there, not just in the official literature, but in what people remember. So I did this survey of 100 pastors. 80 of them responded. They emptied their files, gave me these things they wrote for their church that were on spirit masters and cross-outs and everything. Most of them have died since then. And one pastor who actually not only, I won't mention his name, but I know he's known, this is known about him, but he not only couldn't agree with our fellowship unit concept, but the entire pastoral conference backed him up. And it was still that way in 1961 when there was a district convention. And he said, you made me think about things that I haven't thought about for 35 years. And so that was really the interesting part of it. But, I don't ever say anywhere in my book that we were right. Now, there are some people who read it and say, well, you can still tell he's Wisconsin. But, I have people in the Missouri Synod and the CLC and other historians who say, you were pretty accurate in trying to be fair to both sides. And that's the best thing I could hear. So what's going on now, where we've had these meetings with the three church bodies, and people come up and say, I've read this, and they just didn't know the history like that. And I think there's something essentially different from what I was researching and writing from what, say, Professor Schütze was. He says at the very, very beginning of the book, this is a personal confession of what I believe. Mm-hmm. And he lived through a lot of this. And I just, the more stuff I found, the more I had boxes of stuff. And of course, now I can organize all this stuff electronically and find stuff for that. But so I was not setting out to prove which side was right as much as say, well, this is what happened. And so now they're asking me to do a follow-up called After the Split, what happened then. And of course, now there's much more to work with than there was, and more of these people are still alive. But, I would say what we need in a church body is disinterested historians, not uninterested, they won't do it, but disinterested, meaning they don't go into it deciding already what they want to find. And so therefore, they're likely to only pull out the parts that support. And you can't just go to the archives and say, well, just look around. You got to have an idea where to look for something. But it's the things you find that you're not looking for that are kind of fascinating.
Yeah. You conducted quite a few interviews also, right?
Well, yeah, some people didn't want to write stuff down.
Mm-hmm.
I knew this one old pastor from out west, just a really wonderfully kind, generous man. They had a big conclave of leaders of both synods after Missouri changed his vote about Boy Scouts. And he called me one night. He was in his 80s, and he said, I'm still so angry about this meeting that happened 50 years ago. I can't write it down. I have to talk to you on the phone. And how angry he was when finally somebody on the Wisconsin side asked, well, is it scouting that's changed, or what's changed? And he says, we have become enlightened. That was said by Theodore Grebner, who was the architect of the scouting position papers in Missouri. And he was still so angry, the sense of condescension that he felt. And I think that's, rightly or wrongly, I think that's what was a lot of reaction to this. Missouri kind of was, they found a friend they liked more there in the ALC, and we were boring and cramped their style. Now, not everybody, because there wasn't one simple answer. And so now the Missouri guys now, from Matt Harrison on down are saying, we had no idea. I says, well, that's what we always said. We had no real idea. I was at Bethany last November, and Harrison was there too. And Harrison said, when we meet pastors from the Wisconsin Synod, we always recognize the depth that they have in their doctrine and in their language studies. I call them to shrink under the table a little bit, but, we can all understand the conversation. We maybe can't all write that paper, but we can understand it. I had a cartoon, though, from years ago that had a picture of, it says Bible Translation Committee, and they had all these august-looking guys in there. And one person is in the hall shouting, it's already been done. Now, you say that in our circles, and you say, well, you don't want to tell people that. You want them to come to the Bible as though they've, it's a new thing for them. Well, it's impossible. Even when I had to do qualifying exams in Greek and Hebrew, I knew the Bible passages in English that were on the test. Fortunately.
Yeah, don't let my secret out. Yeah. And so you kind of hinted at the fact that these are deeply personal and in some cases highly sensitive topics and conversations and memories and things. And you had people coming in, like even calling you up and saying, I want to talk to you about it. So how do you build that kind of, I guess, culture around yourself where people are willing to have this conversation with you?
Well, when I did that, and I was in spring of 97, I don't really know. I had done very little writing like that. I had written the 2-page devotions, in Northwestern Lutheran. But I said, I will return all the stuff that you gave me. I made photocopies of what I could, and I saved some of that. And I will not out any of you. I will not tell your names. Somebody might understand who you are. I might even cover some of the details so that you can speak freely. And then I think for many of them it worked, although some didn't respond. I was disappointed a couple of them didn't or wouldn't. By that time, I was a well enough known entity at WLC that I knew some people didn't trust me. And I figured, well, there's such a thing called researcher bias, where some people want to answer because they want to answer for you. Well, those people didn't write to me. But now, since A Tale of Two Synods has been done, I did a paper called The Black Geneva Piety of the WELS, and I asked pastors to talk about different things related to worship. I had the same rules. I won't tell on you. I will cover you. And I've had and now in this new book, I've done this twice. I'm going to do it a third time. And one was I talked to people that were just getting out of school in 1961. Well, there aren't many of them left, and some of them don't remember much, and one died during the process. But I said, okay, we've been talking for years about, is it time to split? When it actually happened, when 1961 came, what happened in your life? I says, I will cover for you. One man told me a story about how Professor Lavrans called him into his office. He was a senior. He was going to wait and get a call in a couple of months. And President Lavrans said, there's a church in South Dakota where the pastor is going to the CLC and he's taken most of the people with him. Would you be willing to accept a call to go and try to salvage what's left? He went. The church is still there. Another person got a letter from his good friend, Richard Youngkins, who just left Watertown and went to, I guess he went to Springfield from there. And he said, they are treating me great here. Another man shared a little blurb of his bulletin the Sunday after we split that said, we are not saying that any of the Missouri Synod we're not judging their faith or saying they're not Christian. We have come to where we cannot resolve this, and I'm very disappointed in our church body's decision. And then you have others, and they tell me this stuff. I think they are willing to trust me with that more. But then sometimes these old guys also call and says, I can't write an email to you anymore. But they'd be on the phone for an hour. I'd have to cut them off, They tell all these stories, and sometimes I'm trying to write this down as fast as I can. And so now I want to do a third piece, and I want them to tell me if they have stories about people who came over from Missouri, pastors or congregations. And, I say anecdotally, we've heard that some of them were just wonderful blessings to us. They came with great traditions for lay involvement and leadership. And in other cases, they were difficult and scared. And they said, you're wearing a white robe. That's what happened in Missouri. Now you're not using the King James. They were gun shy. And I said, I'd like to get some specific instances. Again, no names, no circumstances, but I think this story has to have more sympathy for them and what happened to them. So.
Yeah. I do want to talk about the intertestamental period, but before we do that, do you
have a cutoff time on this?
We go about an hour and a half or so, and then rocking. Yeah, we just kind of we're trying to keep it conversational. What I've found is that people would rather listen to a conversation than they would just like rapid fire questions and things like that.
Yeah, so. There are a few hosts on television that I wish they would learn to ask a question and then shut up.
And the other thing is, frankly, you mentioned earlier, you didn't know we were going to talk about any of this stuff. I didn't either. And what I've actually found that some of my favorite moments on the podcast and some of the things, some of the moments and, sound bites and things that people that I meet, out in the wild, come back to me and they say, well, that was really impactful. That was really meaningful. Were conversations I didn't expect to have. And it had really nothing to do with my interview skills or anything like that. It was just, we're sitting around having a conversation and the right things, the right conversation comes about to be meaningful for the right people. So
I think a lot of people have a need to fill empty space, even in personal conversations. But they're liable to get more if they don't do that.
Yeah.
Or to say very little leading. So how was that for you? Or how did, what did you do then or whatever? And they will talk and they will very often trust you. I always felt kind of like a voyeur when I went into the archives and saw these letters. And, there was just one really heartbreaking letter, which is in an article I wrote where two men who were best of friends in school, and one was a sponsor for the other's children, baptism. He found a way to unsponsor them. I don't trust that you would raise our children in the faith because of where your stand is. Some really bitter, painful things to read. Now, there are people who don't want to read things like that about their church. Of course, my first question is, you must not read most of the Bible either, because the Bible's full of stuff like this too.
Yeah.
But we hope that we can learn something from our past, if no more than to put our brakes on a little bit and not try to resolve something quite so quickly or so absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a little bit of a loaded question. I'll own that. Coming from a WELS guy, right? But when, and this isn't specifically about the Wisconsin Synod, Missouri Synod split or anything like that. Just in general, whether you're across the board, your observations, what are some of the warning signs? Maybe what are some of the patterns you've noticed when things start to get rocky among churches? And you can make the argument one church goes astray, right? Or just churches split. Things don't go well within churches. And there's a lot of that even going on between like individual congregations and things like that at the dissolution of the synodical conference. What, I guess I'm not asking what led up to this. I guess what, maybe I am asking that. Do you know what I'm trying to ask?
Well, you asked it in your email, and I thought about it. I thought, well, I don't know. I think, I don't know. I forget what writer it was who said happy families are happy in 100 different ways. Unhappy families are all unhappy in the same way. I don't know if that really applies here. I think in some cases you get congregations that are extremely isolated where they've had the same, you look in the bulletin and see the names of the people, and you look in the cemetery and you see the same names. They get so closed in, and they haven't had any influx of not people from other church bodies, but even other congregations that have just come with different experiences or whatever. A lot of it is leadership. I mean, the longer, and I can say this because I just didn't have the courage to stay either place too long, but the longer pastors stay, the more of an impact they have on their churches, both for good and for ill. When I retired, one of my friends said to me, "They'll remember you here a long time." I says, "No, I don't think they will, because the whole student body changes every 4 or 5 years. Churches, that can be different. And some pastors are fantastic leaders, and some people were difficult. There are doctrinal issues, but one of the past synod presidents, when he was a district president, he told me once, I have had to deal with something like 35 or 40 people who are asked to leave the ministry. In one case, I would say it was truly a difference in doctrine. It was personal, it was behavior. People do things that they would get fired for in other jobs, but they seem to have a bully pulpit and seem to stay. I have a friend who's volunteering at the archives, going through papers of churches that have closed. And he said it is one sad story. In fact, I would be concerned about him if he'd be like an ambulance driver that all he sees are wrecks, that this would be really, would get to him after a while. He could probably answer that way better than I could, because he sees some of these things repeat. Sometimes it's not the church's fault at all. The neighborhood changes, and circumstances were difficult from the beginning. Lead pastors who are dynamic, and I know this is subject to criticism, but humanly speaking, they are dynamic, and churches grow during their time, and they're the ones, the generation that takes on a second and a third pastor vicars. The same qualities that make the church grow, humanly speaking, also make them difficult to work with sometimes. And then what happens sometimes is the guy dies, and the people who are called to be with him are of such a personality that they don't want to be, as Professor Tiefel used to say, they don't want to be sitting behind the big desk. They don't want that. They're a team player. They're a role player. And then the church goes through a difficult kind of transition about what are we going to do without that person. But
yeah, and I personally have seen that play out too, where you have a big dynamic personality, and then somebody who did very, very well, it seems, in that secondary role. Like that's not the right way to think about it, but it's really the accurate way to think about it, I think, is they're kind of in that secondary pastoral role, get thrust into the forefront, and then how long does it take before at some point you have to say no. Like, you have to have the tough conversation, and if those things don't happen,
well, it's like saying, I came here to be Tonto, not to be the Lone Ranger.
Yeah.
No one will get that anymore.
Yeah.
But I think also that after, I was told this once by a church, observer, that after either a long successful ministry or a long turbulent ministry, the next guy is just going to get chewed up.
Yeah.
And, he says it may not be that person's fault at all. It's just that the change was too great. And then I know one case of where the man who came after the long ministry was this the nicest, most evangelical guy? And he would say I couldn't put my pants on right for the congregation. And the next person came who was difficult, had a touchy personality. He lasted there 30 years and people loved him and sometimes inspired. Oh, that's just pastor being the way he is. So there's a lot of human dynamics there. And I think the fact that we don't have hardly any training in conflict management, I think really puts us all behind the...
It's interesting you say that. It's interesting you say that because I recognized in myself that I mean, over the years, I've had a few of those conversations, never in a pastoral role yet, obviously, but I've had to have a few of those conversations. And when you're teaching kids, especially in the inner city, you have to have some of those blunt conversations too, right? But I started to recognize that, like, I didn't like the way I was approaching them. So I became a basketball official, and I'm now a varsity basketball official. And one of the big driving factors, like, I do enjoy the game of basketball. It's a good reason to stay in relative shape. I haven't done a great job of that either, but
you're holding your own.
Yeah, trying. I'm wearing a loose shirt.
Look at this sweater here. This is enormous.
But there was one of the big driving forces behind the decision to try and do that part-time while I was at the seminary and get as far along in the process as I could was because I wanted to get better at, one, being able to clearly explain under pressure what's going, like, not only knowing and internalizing it, but then being able to deal with the pressure situation. Mm-hmm. And I wanted more experience being the one guy in the room that everyone's upset with at the same time, right? It's like there's nobody, like, when you're, as a basketball official, and probably an official of anything, but like a referee for anything, when you're a basketball official, everybody on one side thinks you're against them. Everybody on the other side thinks you're against them. The only people on your team are the other two officials, and about half the time, they also aren't necessarily on your side, even if they're your teammate. And I wanted more experiences where I was in that kind of a dynamic, but it was also kind of safe, you know? It's proven, I can see a change in myself and in my ability to deal with some of those circumstances.
Well, that's good you did that. I'm glad you're learning from that. And I think not everybody is inclined to want to learn that about themselves. In most cases, being a pastor gives you a lot of, I won't say exactly authority. You get kind of used to people doing what you... I followed somebody who was very strong that way, and people had a problem with me because, well, Pastor, what do you want? And I didn't necessarily want anything about something which was just administrative or what's going to last you the longest, what's going to help you here. They were not prepared for that. I did some church consulting, with the old system that we had years ago. And there were differences, for example, between going to rural churches where not many people went to college and they weren't used to that kind of management. Each was his own farmer or small businessman, versus you have a church of a lot of people who are middle and upper level management, and they had a very different set of skills. And I think we should really pray for our circuit pastors and our district presidents. I don't know if they learn conflict management on the fly, but they have to, because they're dealing with so much of this.
Yeah.
I went to see my district president once in a second congregation where I'd inherited a few problems, and I didn't know if I should stay after 3 years. And he said to me, the kindest thing I can say is that I haven't heard a word from anybody in that church since you've been there. And that's how it should be. Churches that are doing okay, they don't need that kind of publicity, But he, of course, had to move on to some other church where there was a problem.
Yeah. We've actually had this conversation a couple of times too, with people going out for Vicar year, right? And they've got, as they should, everybody's excited about going out for Vicar year. All my classmates are pumped, and they got the countdown on the board and everything. And I also am looking forward to Vicar year. I'm looking forward to by the grace of God, being able to serve somewhere as a parish pastor and so forth. I would love to, I think, someday serve in a different role than that too, like maybe teaching things like that. But I've discovered about myself that I am so much more sober about what lies ahead for me than a lot of my peers. And I'm not sure that's a totally bad thing. I hope it changes a little bit. I would like to be a little bit more. Obviously, I want to be here and I want to be doing this. I love being a seminarian, and I can't think of anything else I would rather do with my life than be in ministry, specifically serving in some sort of pastoral role. At the same time, like the ministry experience that I do have, I sinful people are sinful people whether they know Jesus or not, and you got to deal with that.
Yeah,
you got to deal with that.
Yeah. Well, I have nothing to add to that. That's it. You're right.
Yeah.
One of us in my class asked one of the really, mature, older, veteran professors. He said, "What can you tell us that'll help us be better pastors?" He said, "Be a pastor for 10 years. You just can't get some of this any other way." So I think you're reflecting your broader experience than maybe a lot of them have had. But, we can hardly expect that we're going to be so well always received, because Jesus said no servant is above his master. If the master suffers, expect the servants will suffer too. He told us all along that this is going to happen. So what's the surprise?
Yeah. Well, the readings this morning was Beatitudes in Luke, right?
Yeah.
Blessed are you. I don't know. I guess I had the Matthew memorized and not the Luke, but blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me.
Yeah.
Those are some radical and crazy words.
You're not happy, but you're blessed.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. You brought up a couple of different times that you really wanted to teach on the intertestamental period at WLC. You've got a passion for it. You've written you literally wrote the book on it, right? Maybe not the book like the other one, but
a short book.
A short book. All right. Well, our listeners will like that because they're more likely to read a short book. That sounded like I was insulting my listeners, but they're busy people.
Well, but I think also people are going to say, there's so much of the Bible I don't know.
Yeah.
Why should I take the time to spend, reading about what happened in that time period? Secondly, there's just no getting around that there's some history there, and not everybody likes history the same way. But I think, if you have an Old Testament professor say the best thing you can do to understand Jesus better is learn the Old Testament better, well, right up there with it is learning the intertestamental period, because so many things developed and happened then, and all the Bible does is turn the page. Maybe there's a page you can put down all your grandchildren's name, or, where you put your theater tickets or something, and then immediately you're confronted with so many things being different, and why are they that way, and how did they get to be that way? I mean, that's from that point of view, that's helpful. Surprisingly, the Apocrypha is better than a lot of people think. There are reasons why the books have been excluded from Protestant and Lutheran Bibles, but there are also many good statements of faith, and there are some that just say this. He isn't, Sirach is not speaking the same way that Solomon did in the Proverbs. I mean, even though there are some things that seem similar. But I've come to decide that you had these four groups. I mean, there were more than four groups, and one of them, like the Essenes, are never actually mentioned in the New Testament, but they're all over the New Testament in terms of the behavior and stuff. These were answers that Judaism tried to have to continue to exist. And they're gone. Those groups are gone, although Pharisaism pretty much kept itself going in rabbinic Judaism. The groups are gone, but the impulses behind them remain. And so you've got the Pharisees who said, we will make more rules to put around the rules, to explain them, to give you a boundary line, to be kind of help people identify that you're one of us, not one of them. You have the Sadducees who said, we will accommodate to the bigger power. That Rome, Greece, we can't fight them. Let's join in. You had the Zealots who said the only good Roman is a dead Roman. We're going to use political force or military force and have our way. And you have the Essenes who said, to hell with all of you. We're going to have our own little huddle, have nothing with anybody else. These are still, what should I say? These are still not goals, but these are still, I can't think of the word I want. There's still ways to try to do church that still don't work. Putting more rule and Protestants, Lutherans will always say, well, we're not the Catholic Church. We don't live and die by tradition. Ask anybody in your church that recently joined and say, do we have any unwritten rules here or expectations? Oh my goodness. Right down to political persuasions, which I don't think has ever been stronger in my memory than it is now. You better be a Lutheran and be a Republican. And yet, that didn't work for them it doesn't work for us. But some of the things the New Testament church did, to confess, to be willing to suffer, to not compromise, to care about the people who are the least valuable, the least, the less, the lost, to serve people, in health and in the poor and all that. Those are different lessons. So,
how much you said that if you really want to understand Jesus better, obviously read the Old Testament, but the intertestamental period can guide our understanding of Jesus quite a bit too. What you talked about the different kind of Jewish sects, if you will. What, just practically speaking, what insights, I guess, because that's kind of the whole book, but just practically speaking, what are we learning about, what are we getting out of the study of the intertestamental period that you're missing if you don't have any understanding of it?
Well, I suppose part of it is just the real basic thing that why are these names the way they are? Why are there, what goes on, the most visible week of the church every year is Holy Week. Why are things the way they are here? What is this Roman ruler here? What is the stress between these two? What was it? Why were the Jews in such an apparently difficult position, although some of it was of their own making? And for all we know about the Pharisees, Jesus got followers from the Pharisees. He agreed more with them than he did with the other three groups, which is kind of surprising. So, I hear certain passages in the Gospels differently, not the doctrine, but what's going on differently because of knowing that this or that happened there. I mean, Paul Meyer wrote a little novel about Pontius Pilate. That's what it's called. It was mostly made up, of course, but he has a list of notes in the back. And there's a section there where Pilate is in Rome deciding whether or not he wants to take this position in Judea because it's difficult. And of course, a guy goes there and does well. He's going to have a big retirement, great. But one of his friends says to him, why would you want to go there? They're the most ungovernable people in the empire. So Paul Meyer was at the college, and I offered to give him a ride back to the airport. And I said, do you have an actual source on that? That people actually said that at that time they're the most ungoverned. He says, well, not exactly, but I think that was true. And there are things about them. If you have 20 gods, you can have 21, but if you have one, you can't have two. And they were always a difficulty that way. But they managed to get pretty much protection over time in the empire. But then Christians, people thought they were just another Jewish bunch, and they seemed to be more difficult because they seemed to challenge their reverence for the Christ seemed to be in conflict with what they should be as Roman citizens. And so you get this sense of this tug of war that Jesus is in the middle of. He didn't come to a safe place, a complicated place. And so for those of us who wish for easier times and less difficult challenges, well, we don't get to pick that time. So here we are. I think to some extent, we can see that Jesus' storytelling was based, he got some of his stories from the Jewish tradition, but then he changed the punchline sometimes. There was a story among the Jewish rabbis that said, the day is coming when Messiah, blessed be his name, will bring all of the children of Abraham back from the north and south, and they will be in the kingdom, and all the Gentiles will be thrown out. So Jesus meets this woman who was willing to accept the crumbs from the table. So he says, you have great faith, and many people from the north and south and east and west will come to the table at the kingdom, and the children of the kingdom will be thrown out. That was a direct opposite punchline. I mean, no wonder they wanted to kill him after 3 years, because he had really challenged so much of what they'd done. So the picture of gentle Jesus, meek and low, keeper of the status quo, is not what you get when you read about what the times were like then that he was in. So,
yeah. What do you think it is that made the Jews so difficult to manage, from the Roman perspective?
Well, they had such a very high sense of themselves and their history. I mean, the Jews at the time, let's say in the couple centuries before Jesus, were not so much in Palestine, but other places like Alexandria and other synagogues. They were really eager to demonstrate that they really had a long, distinctive culture, great prophets. They had all this written scripture, they had the wisdom, and even tried to show that maybe the Greek and Roman writers had gotten some of this from them. On the other hand, they were trying to make Judaism respectable to people. So what do they do with the stories that are disturbing? They allegorize these. Origen said, anything that's not worthy of God, I allegorize. And so they were in that position. And see, that's a subject that we can understand. People that are trying to make Christianity more palatable to the modern mind and cut this out and change this, and that was difficult. So they had this great sense of themselves. I think some of it was pride and arrogance for sure, but some of it was genuine piety. And it felt that there are things that they just wouldn't do that the pagans did.
Yeah.
And then Paul comes along and says, well, you don't have to really require these things anymore. Well, then he was part of the problem too.
Yeah. And you have a group of people that for centuries have been very, very interested in self-preservation.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like you just said about Paul, just one more guy shows up. First, you got this Jesus guy stirring the pot, and now you've got a former Pharisee stirring the pot. Just one more instance where you got to straighten things back up.
We thought we were rid of him, and now he's somehow cloning something of himself and other people.
Yeah.
And Paul said that. He says, if you think anyone thinks they have reason to put trust in the flesh, I have more. And he went right down the list, all these things that he had. So he was what the Pharisees were trying to be like him, like Pharisees like him. So I think that the most remarkable thing about Paul is how well he must have known the Old Testament laws and where he could give ground if one person regards one day alike, and I don't care. But you start saying you have to be circumcised, that's another issue entirely. And he could pick his fights so carefully. And yet they still cut his head off when he was done.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Jews seem to have a miraculous ability to get other people to do their dirty work for them.
Well, yeah. I'm not so knowledgeable about medieval Jewish history. I was remember Professor Scharf talked about one conversation between, I want to say, Metternich and somebody else, and I don't know if the story to even be telling it, but the question was about the existence of God and God's role, and the answer was, my answer is the Jews. How could they have survived? You should find the real story and get it straight what the points are. But because so many other people became what their culture around them was. How many Jews that went to Babylon, stayed there, became Babylonian, became this, became that. And there was enough of them that they just would not submit. Now, is that stubbornness and arrogance? Is it a firm belief that they are right? And yet Judaism itself there's no savior. There's no very clear sense of life after death. It's really kind of saddening to talk to, Reformed Jews and see how their view of God is very limited, very philosophical. And, well, I don't know,
Yeah. Oh, and you listen to guys like some of the more, visible of the conservative Jewish cultures that are kind of still around, like guys like Prager and who's Ben Shapiro, some of those guys, and they'll straight up say like, well, it's working for us, and like that's basically their take on their own religion. Where you go, there's got to be more than that, right?
Yeah,
there's got to be more than that. That how like if that's really the end of the discussion for you, I don't understand. Yeah, I don't understand.
Yeah, so you could try the Vegas approach and say, well, if you're right and I'm wrong, I got nothing to lose. But if I'm right and you're wrong, you're in really big trouble. I invited a rabbi a couple of times to come to my class and talk. One of them was a Reform rabbi who was like a stand-up comedian. I mean, he had just line after line. He says, in the Unitarian Church, the only time the name of Jesus is heard is when the janitor fell down the back steps. He's just going on and on. Finally, he says, you got to stop where you are, or I'll have to pay a cover charge on you. And but then the other guy I asked was he's a very Orthodox rabbi, Michael. He was at a big synagogue in the west side of Milwaukee, and I saw his name. I got a hold of him. I said, would you come and talk about Judaism? Well, he comes. And he tells us, he's got all the garb on, and people want to shake hands with him. He's not going to shake hands with anybody because he doesn't know to just have their cycle, And so he's saying that and the more he's there, the more uncomfortable he gets. And it's like he told us, for example, all my family has arranged marriages, 100 first cousins, all arranged marriages, 2 divorces. I've challenged that against any one of your families. It was interesting, but then he said, I've been bothered by the people in our neighborhood that have this bumper sticker on their car that says, come to the WELS, and they're coming after Jewish people in my neighborhood. And I think what he realizes, I'm in one of those places. He didn't say that, but he got more and more agitated. And so we got to the end of the discussion, and he said again, he says, he wishes that these people want to try to make Jews into Christians that's terrible. It's anti-Semitism. And so I remember that I answered much better than I'm sure that I did. But I says, what are we going to do about this? I said, because you believe that any Christian trying to talk about his faith in a Jewish Savior is anti-Semitic and hostile to you. And we call it evangelism. It's good news. And for us to not tell people about Jesus because they're Jewish is wrong. What are we going to do? And he's very clever. He just said, there's enough that don't believe anything for both of us to work on. So, well, you got out of the situation. But he was clearly uncomfortable to be there. And, well, students would find stuff like that interesting at the time, but then they'd say, what's on the test? So they in the end, I think they were more disturbed by that than if I had just given them the basic talk about this or that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that's a question that's worth talking about a little bit more. Like why... I get that. So I'm working for Truth and Love. So working quite a bit with the LDS community. And I get that question a lot. Like, why are you targeting us? Like, why are you trying to hurt our church? Why are you so forth? And I've actually used a very similar, depending on the conversation, I'll use this all the time, but depending on the conversation, I'll even say something to that effect of like, look, if what you believe is true, I'm going to a slightly better place than earth. Doesn't really matter how the rest of my life goes. Whatever follows the end of this life, I'm going to be all right. It might not be the same place you get to go to, but I'm going to be all right. Everything will be fine. But if what I believe is true and usually I have a Bible with me and say, and what this book says, if that's true, then there's no place for you other than outer darkness.
Yeah.
And I'm terrified of that for you. And I don't want you there. I want to see you in, heaven and celestial kingdom with me and with Jesus. And I want you there for eternity. And I don't want you to have to deal with this. And what kind of love would it be? I claim I love people. What kind of love would it be if I said, you know what, I think this is where you're going, but I'm not going to bother to tell you?
Yeah, well, that's right. And we really are very pointed about people who question the existence of hell or, and yet, well, what are we doing about it if we really feel that strong about it? I mean, I would tell, my class has got more and more diverse as we went along. And I said, I can't believe for you. But I want you to understand what Christianity is saying, and I'll pray for you. But I said, at least I want you to hear it from somebody who believes it and who understands it probably fairly well. I don't want you to learn it from Bill Maher, what his view of Christianity is. And you want to kind of get the snappy punchline. I says, well, on someday you can't ever say no one told you. I'm not going to say that, but I'm thinking it sometimes. You can't plead ignorance because you've heard it. And it is not just an intellectual thing, as you know, it's also, they see caring in other places and they see integrity in people, or they don't. And they may intellectually say there's a lot here, but they see the lack of integrity or caring. That'll really be often a death knell for someone to consider that.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. I'm really, really thankful that you came on.
Well, I'm glad you said we could have done this on the phone originally, but I'm really glad we did this.
Yeah. I far prefer doing this in person. Yeah. The picture, you are not in any, last time we filmed in this room, we talked about the pictures on the walls. You are not in the pictures on these walls. You're upstairs somewhere. Because these are all the, like I said, the further you get into the basement, the less likely it is that you're still alive. And these
when you're
guys,
down here, you're dead. Yeah.
yeah, when you're down here, you're dead. So
I wonder where these pictures are going to go with the proposed addition. Will they be in those hallways?
I don't know.
That
it's
would
an
make
interesting
more sense.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is a little bit of a if you don't know, they're talking about adding on to the seminary and building new classrooms and things like that. There is something about knowing, like when I was sitting in classroom 32 up there, knowing that even before that room was a classroom, it was a library, and now it's been a classroom for almost pushing 80 years. The idea that all these men on the walls sat in these rooms also.
Oh, yeah.
And, there's a little bit of that. Progress is progress, and it happens, right? But there's just something special about being in this place with those pictures on the wall and sitting in those desks, and I'm very thankful for the experience. So,
I used to tell a story about Larry Bird. It's a true story that he, grows up in a little town, has no, I think the
French lick.
I think the first time he was at an NBA game was when he was with the Celtics. And he said, I would see these guys come back, Bob Cousy and all these. And he says it was almost kind of, aren't his words, it was almost like a spiritual feeling that they all surrounded you. And now was your time to be on the court, so to speak. And it makes you think of the past, you're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Now we're here. And, when I was teaching in Winthrop, I spent almost every day walking around the halls looking at these faces, because now I know so many more of them, or at least know something about, in some cases, tragic things, really sad things that have happened to them, or people that have gone a different direction or whatever. And others who just look like ordinary guys, and their lives have just been such a blessing. And you're part of that group, Of course, I'm embarrassed that my particular section has all that girly long hair. Yeah. And these plaid sport coats that look like we stole them off of horses somewhere, of a blanket. There's only a few years like that, and then that all goes away.
Well, I think part of the reason for that, the seniors just took their pictures the other day, and one of the professors was joking, it looked like a funeral director convention or something like that, because they make them wear black blazers now. Look at some of these pictures. You don't want to talk about your graduation pictures the way these guys talk about their graduation pictures.
And the seminary prides itself on not being legalistic and making rules about stuff.
That's fair. Well, this one's for their own good, I think.
Sure.
Let some of these guys wear to class. It's for their own good.
That's what legalists always say.
I will. You know what? The black blazers, I think that's a good hill to die on.
Well, I mean, they could be a little bit. Yeah. Navy blue is good.
Yep.
White
if you want something exciting in your picture, wear an exciting tie.
Yeah, even that. Yeah. And of course, we were all recovering from our late Beatle haircuts. Some of them were pretty bad. But
at least you didn't have mullets. There's a few mullets, some pretty epic mullets.
That's true. And we survived, I think, the Nehru jacket year too.
Oh yeah.
It only lasted a little while, but we were like, my group was sort of high school people when that came, and so guys' grandmothers bought them one of these, and then you'd go, oh man, and then the loud shirt to go with it. So there's no solution, because I don't like that looking. Wearing a white shirt and tie with that was an unding too. So
yeah. Well, thank you for being on the show. Glad to have you. Like I said at the beginning, there are links down in the show notes below. I'll make sure I link I'll put a link down there to a few of Dr. Braun's books as well.
Good,
thank you. Glad to have you here. I'm glad that you guys are watching and listening. If you like the content that you're experiencing here on this channel, make sure you go and make a $5 cup of coffee donation as well. Help support the work that we're doing. God bless you, and we'll see you again soon.